The slides are information rich, and I hope that they'll serve as a resource or reference for you in the future. Very glad to take questions at the end that we can drill down into particular areas of interest. Sorry, you'll have to forgive me. We're kind of moving through the slides at the same time as we move through the talk. So in terms of an opening of the starting points for my talk, there is a very close connection between asset management and climate resilience, I think already established by the previous day's sessions, and had the pleasure of seeing the beginning. So I'll try not to retread the discussion there. But as jumping off points, I couldn't help but see when I looked at the Asset Management Ontario's definition of those key principles, the alignment. And to some degree, these questions are binary in that we can make a choice to be informed and act or not, in both regarding climate resilience and asset management. A second jumping off point for my talk is that these days, every investment, and every related asset management decision matters as much as it ever did. And that will become more abundant in the next couple slides. I also believe that addressing the social, the climate, the environmental and economic imperatives together is best addressed at the community scale. And in regard to co-benefits, I believe that natural infrastructure offers some promise and momentum is building. The fourth jumping off point is that I believe that we can, through this talk, you'll see that much progress has been made in regard to climate resilient infrastructure, but much is yet to be done. And doing so can be a very empowering and creative opportunity. This next slide is, I thought, very interesting. Recent cartoon came out during the pandemic, and the small print reads of the people in the city, "Be sure to wash your hands and all will be well." I like this cartoon, although I can see that it could be seen as disempowering in some respects. And as, in essence, an adaptation planner, when we can be disempowering in the sense that we talk about trying to manage what you cannot avoid and avoid what you cannot manage, there's a fair amount to be dealt with in this photo, as you see the waves of COVID, recession, climate change, biodiversity collapse. And yes, it is true that the pandemic is an amplifying pressure to make us act in the short term with the long term in mind, and particularly those of you who are stewards of long-lived assets. It also exacerbates existing vulnerabilities or inequities. But I'd like to see if there's a way to interpret this as somewhat empowering, because in my mind, the challenges represented by these waves highlight the need and the opportunity to really redefine success and what really matters to society. It speaks to the denial of truths to be faced and how context and perception truly matter. I'll next turn to talking a bit about the impacts that we're seeing. This is references the Canada and a Changing Climate 2019 report that was discussed briefly yesterday, and some of the key findings that it came forward with. And so it spoke about Canada having a climate that has warmed to date, and is warming more. And in fact, I mean, from 1948 to 2016, I think we've, over land, the average temperature annually has warmed on average 1.7 degrees Celsius. So that's far greater than the 0.8 degrees Celsius of the globe. And in fact, our winter temperatures have increased 3.3 degrees Celsius. So the effects have already started to take place, and more certainly are anticipated. These have impacts in terms of, as noted on the screen here. I guess I should particularly draw out the flooding, because I think that's in many ways, one of the most costly aspects of climate impacts for communities and infrastructure, as well as coastal erosion. But intensity and frequency are watchwords to those in this, follow this domain. And the significance of these impacts is increasingly being quantified and noted. We know that since 2008, we've had 230 major disasters in our country. We also know these disasters are experienced differently, in that people living on First Nations reserves in Canada are 18 times more likely to be evacuated as a result of disasters such as wildfires, floods, and severe storms. And in fact, since 2009, 112,000 on-reserve community residents have been evacuated at different times. So this is important for us to understand that the red bar charts, these are small text, I'm sorry for that to see, but the red increasing in the bar charts are water-related damages from flood, storm surge, coastal erosion. And some of these the references are here on the page, but there's also a reference slide at the end of this deck for those of you to have it. I'd now like to speak a little bit more about some visuals, I guess, on the range of hazards. And I was inspired for this slide from David Lapp, a legend from Engineers Canada formerly, who's worked on PIVC, to characterize some of the challenges we face in terms of infrastructure and climate change impacts and our communities. I think I'll let that slide speak for itself, and we can come back to it if needed. What's important from an asset management climate resilience perspective, and it's great to see Dustin walk through, in essence, a bit of that risk assessment, is to think about the types of hazards and the challenges they present to our communities. And this slide, again, I've helped borrowed with permission from David Lapp, I think is helpful for a quick snapshot of what we face in regard to different hazards and different types of infrastructure. And again, severity, frequency are watchwords in this domain. And we know that climate is an amplifier. The next slide speaks actually to overall the point that climate impacts are part of the story, and they can be the straw that breaks the camel's back. But in fact, there's many things that go in the interplay here between when David presented this slide to engineers in Newfoundland, he explained how the capacity is the design capacity of infrastructure, and I think this is a danger of speaking to far more experts in the audience here today. We design engineering to take a certain load, and then we design that in the capacity, but we can see that capacity affected by unforeseen weathering, the aging, and also the design load, the pressures on that capacity. In fact, whether it's population growth. And I think about a little of the infill lots and intensification, which has many benefits for transit planning. But when we have houses that cover more of the lot, it allows less water to go into the ground. So you can see changes in land use over time. And in fact, now I think we have 15,000 square kilometers of Canadian communities built up. So that's a lot of land. And a lot of land in many ways that's in floodplains or on the edge of floodplains. There's a wide recognition of these impacts, and you can see that in the 16th report on the Global Risk Report from the World Economic Forum released this past January. Annually, they survey leading business leaders, and the top two risks in terms of likelihood this year, like many of the previous years, speak to extreme weather events with major damage to property, as well as the failure of climate change mitigation adaptation. By impact, those climate change action failure was replaced this year, obviously, by infectious disease. Extreme weather was replaced by the result of the pandemic. But environment and climate have featured highly in many of the recent years. In 2021, there was a landmark study. Sorry, I'm confusing the next one. But in 2021, we saw the release of the total of 570 municipalities who've now, at this point, passed a binding motion declaring climate to be an emergency. I was pleased to see a survey in 2019 that showed that 40% of local governments have been taking some form of action adaptation planning. But when I started to mention a landmark study, it was really the 2020 Federation of Canadian Municipalities and Insurance Bureau of Canada study that's wanted to get a handle on estimating the costs from avoiding the worst impacts of climate change at the municipal level. And through extrapolating different case studies, they came up with a number of $5.3 billion a year could be spent by all levels of government to give us a sense of the quantity, the quantum or magnitude of that spend. These also follow another important study in 2019 of the Canadian Council of Academies, an independent body that went to look at the top climate risks for the country. And it determined public infrastructure to be very much at the top, but also one of the domains in which we had the most opportunity to reduce those threats. When we take a wider angle lens to this discussion, it's valuable to think, and I saw in your write-up, you're asking me to speak a little bit about our work with the United States. And in fact, it's auspicious today on a day that our Prime Minister is meeting with the President of the United States, the new administration, and several cabinet members on both sides to speak to how the United States is taking account of resilience. And so we're seeing very much an emphasis in their discussions with their infrastructure spending about climate and making sure these are durable investments. We've also noted when John Kerry spoke to the Climate Action Summit in early January, and other global leaders, including our own Prime Minister as well, he spoke about the need to emphasize work on managing risk, using climate data, bettering the quality of our adaptation programming, and also multilateral collaboration. I was pleased that last month in January, we also had officials from the National Research Council go participate in a workshop with the United States National Institute for Science and Technology to look at how do we advance incorporation of future climate data into standards and building codes for infrastructure. So there's a fair amount going on, and David Hayes, a special advisor to President Biden on climate change, has spoken about the need for metrics, the need for pre-sponding, the need to change the money flowing from FEMA to prioritize disadvantaged communities, consider much more use of natural infrastructure approaches, and to reward those states that have strong adaptation plans. So we're aware of those things. Our office is actually working with the United States and the government of Mexico in regard to some coastal management matters. And we also have technical guidelines on coastal hazard assessment, which we're working with the United States on as well. So a lot of collaboration, but more globally, we had the conclusion of the 2-year Global Commission on Adaptation. I think Ambassador Fuller spoke about that, so I won't go into that, but there are 2 sister bodies that are, or sub-initiatives. One is the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. This is led by India, and it's a knowledge exchange platform in the public sector. How can we learn from each other's experiences of managing climate impacts? The other major body is the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, and that's, as explained on the slide, a large grouping of institutional investors and others looking at how do we better integrate climate risk. Sorry, I just advanced a slide there. Finally, I was going to mention that in January, the World Bank also released a new resilience rating system that merits further look. We are, Canada, participating in the G20 Global Infrastructure Hub, and an office was opened in Toronto in 2019. And that G20 initiative is to focus on sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure, and it parallels work by the United Nations Environment Program, in which they've recently put out a sustainable infrastructure partnership, talking about 10 principles for COVID recovery, focusing on sustainable and, again, resilient infrastructure. So much more that could be unpacked there. I'd like to turn to mentioning the demand for green recovery. It's widespread. There's many voices who've spoken about this, and I can see that I'm going to be short on time, so I'm going to have to accelerate a little bit, but I will just give you this glimpse that there's many key voices out there speaking about the need to get triple value out of our spending in terms of economy, social, environment. How do we define success in climate resilient infrastructure? Well, we've been pursuing it and thinking about it this way, that it's infrastructure that either protects a community or it helps to withstand itself, maintain its integrity over time. Increasingly, I'm thinking that the withstanding involves accommodating some forms of climate impacts, and whether that's the more permeable urban land cover as a form of accommodation. But those are the 2 sides, in essence, I see to climate resilient infrastructure. And what we try to do through our work is to focus on these decisions related to location, design, build, and planned operation and maintenance. And asset management is so integral to the latter, but really has threads across all of them. Certainly, as we've already mentioned, it can be traditional or natural. In fact, most often a hybrid when we think about a green roof. Rehabilitation and new builds are both a part of it as well. Why do we pursue this? Well, there's human costs. We can help the economy, we can help the quality of life in communities. Principally, the total cost of ownership, we believe, will decrease through making the wise prevention investments. It almost is as simple as the story of not building a straw house on a windy cliff. There's a lot of quantification underway on the costs and benefits, and some of the guidelines that, pleased to say, that have come out of our work with the National Research Council. There's an annex in this presentation that speaks to some of that work, on these guidelines relating to wildland-urban interface management for wildfire, as well as flood-resistant buildings, are showing very strong rates of return. We've seen up to 10 to 1 sort of payback, or even 12 to 1 payback. This, of course, is against the backdrop of what many have called a significant infrastructure deficit in Canada, and particularly for Indigenous communities. In the Canadian context, what have we been doing? Some of this was captured again yesterday, so I'll speak to it briefly. But it was great to have Dustin Carey speak about the Federation of Canadian Municipalities programs like the Municipal Climate Innovation Program. We've also supported the National Research Council, and there's a website link at the back of this deck on some of the work coming out of that. We provide funding, cost shared for public infrastructure. Some of it targets the resilience and adaptation, disaster mitigation specifically, such as the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund. May be curious to know that we received 3 times the amount of funding we had in requests that we had available to disperse through the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund. And now we've been able to allocate $1.9 billion across 68 projects from that fund. There's other broader national strategies underway, and commitments in the January 15th supplemental minister mandate letter came to our minister to create a national infrastructure assessment. I thought that would be of interest to this audience, as well as to participate in the creation of a national adaptation strategy. And there's also talk about a federal climate lens applied to federal operations. What have we done in terms of knowledge products? I'm going to have to skip this. It's featured at the end of the deck, but what I'd most like to say here is that for 660 locations across the country, we've been able to put online future climate data for precipitation, wind, temperature in the form of that's used of variables like heating degree days by engineers in the National Building Code. And so Canada's in essence leading the world in this regard, and some important work there. The climate lens itself I'd like to touch on, and it really, Business Infrastructure Canada's applied this to across a number of our funds. And one half of it, not the greenhouse gas reduction half, but the other side focuses on resilience, as many people know. And what we go through is we ask the project proponents coming to us to carry out a risk assessment of the likelihood, the consequence of adverse climate impacts and natural hazards on the functionality, the lifespan of their assets. And we've been able to see sort of blend in a number of principles into this in terms of trying to make life easier, that the assessments should be proportionate to the scale, the criticality of the asset that's being reviewed. We think that the best resilience and risk assessments are systemic, that they offer insight into multiple benefits, and they also choose those no regrets approaches first, and they leave flexibility for decision making over time. I imagine that's of great importance in the asset management world. What we've seen to date in over the 91 climate resilience assessments completed under the climate lens, valued at over $5.3 billion in the federal funding contribution to those, is that the 60% of them have shown the high risk interactions to be managed, dealt with, and 70% of them have shown medium risk interactions across issues of precipitation, wind, heavy snow, ice, flooding, those types of matters. Very pleased to see that the risk reduction measures coming out of the climate lens address the span of location, design, build, planned operation, maintenance, staffing, and monitoring and event protocols. And we see also that in consideration of natural infrastructure is included. I don't think I'm going to have as much time as I'd hoped to go into natural infrastructure. I will say that I think that many people have an intuitive sense of what this is. I'm going to try to skip ahead to this definition from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which is that it is the intentional alignment of natural and engineering processes to efficiently and sustainably deliver economic, environmental, and social benefits. And it can be at the watershed scale, the neighborhood scale, and coastal areas. There's a number of examples here, be they wetlands or green roofs or the living dikes and oyster reefs. This is really important to think about in a context where Southern Ontario has lost 70% of our wetlands over the last century. And so I skipped ahead there. I just want to touch base. There's a little bit of a graphic here, which people may want to look at in the future about urban tree cover to deal with extreme heat waves, and certainly a great deal of natural infrastructure focused on water. And sorry, I wanted to mention that there's 4 main domains at the bottom of this slide. Extreme heat, as we mentioned, stormwater, rivering, flood management, coastal management. And in fact, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature has released a global standard recently about use of natural infrastructure. So I'm going to proceed to mention that this is very real, the use of natural infrastructure. The City of Vancouver's Rain City strategy has been award-winning, and it has strong metrics on the amount of stormwater diverted from the pipes and managing treatment. And there are ways to think about how we've done things traditionally, where we've thought about, I'm in the water utility department, or in some cases, I'm in the port authority department. And maybe I would think about sort of a seawall protection, or the transit department. This is actually a graphic from the World Resource Institute, but it argues that there's a more transdisciplinary or interdepartmental, in essence, opportunities provided by natural infrastructure that merit consideration, and where living shorelines, complete green streets can offer a great deal of benefit. So as I wrap up here, I just want to mention that there's obviously, we're talking about culture change. We're talking about new information to understand the uncertainty of a changing climate, where things matter most, where we can make the biggest difference with the energy and the dollars we have. These are fairly standard, I think, challenges in this domain, but I think that it's important we talk about the culture change and working across silos. So I think that's well trodden ground for those of us in the planning and the municipal profession. But I do think that this term multi-solving has a lot of value to think about in these days. And where I began with the waves, I think that there's an opportunity in the world of resilience to pursue agency and empowerment as we think about how do we address the inequalities, how do we work on behavior and lifestyle changes, how do we think about the ecosystem's integrity and working together as communities and people-centered planning. So I thought that the World Resource Institute offers some hopeful thoughts that way. And these are discussion starters I can leave on the screen. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I will actually think I'm within my 30 minutes, but these are important considerations, and perhaps they'll spur some thoughts for discussion now or throughout the remainder of today's conference. But in many ways, we're talking about rapid learning, we're talking about co-benefits and an evolving understandings. We know that there's disproportionate impacts of climate change in communities, and how do we develop new knowledge, guidance and standards that's helpful. There's a great deal of references I've left to hopefully be helpful to those of you who receive this, and there are a couple end slides here on the work that we've done with the National Research Council to advance our thinking.